This is the concluding prayer for evening prayer this evening. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
God our Father, the contradiction of the cross proclaims your infinite wisdom. Help us to see that the glory of your Son is revealed in the suffering he freely accepted. Give us faith to claim as our only glory the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, God forever and ever. Amen. Father, Spirit. Amen. Well, Norm, so nice that you not only volunteered to take the lead today, but you gave us some of your manuscript. So lead us, introduce us to your work.
I'm happy to do that. I'm considering this a book launch, and there's no other group I'd rather launch it to. So thanks for everyone for being here and for helping me to do this. And thanks especially to Father Mark and also to Charles when I suggested that we could do this. They were more than happy to oblige. And so that's really great. I thought that I would sort of follow the Peter model in which, you know, one talks very little at the beginning to introduce it and then leaves it open to discussion. So I thought I would maybe just say a word or two about why I wrote the book, and then a word or two about the excerpts, the preface, the introduction, the second chapter, and then the conclusion. And I'll try to keep this brief and then just throw it open and treat it like we do any of the readings that we do. So does that sound like a plan?
Sure. Sounds good.
All right. So the reason why I wrote the book, well, it comes out of my teaching of second-year undergraduate course that I've been teaching for a long time. And my general observation that not so much in the classroom, a little bit in the classroom, but just in conversations with people and in conversations with parents of students elsewhere outside of the university setting, that literary theory seems to confuse a fair number of people. And if I can be a little melodramatic, for some people, it seems to eat them alive. And so I think there's still scope, even though we've been writing about literary theory for a long time. I think there's still scope for further introductions to it and reflections on it, and trying to help people become acclimatized to theory. So I think that was probably the main reason why I wanted to write this book. Another reason was that a lot of introductions to literary theory treat theory like it's a smorgasbord. They'll give a little bit of the history, and then they'll introduce basically theory by theory by theory. And I think the student is left, or the reader is left, with the impression that you can just, you know, choose between these theories at will. And that, I think, denies one of theory's first principles, which is that we're bounded and we're situated and we're constrained in ways that we don't even realize. And yet the way these textbooks are laid out, to me, it seems to reify the idea that you are like a consumer or free floating, and that you can choose and apply something at will. So I thought I would, you know, try to do something a little bit different in the way that I wrote the book, and also like in the way that I teach the material in the classroom. So those are a couple things that were kind of motivating me as I wrote. So I'm just going to say a couple of things about each of the excerpts now, and then I'll throw it open. I think that the preface is pretty self-explanatory. All I wanted to do there was I wanted people to be able to get into the book relatively easily. I think Balthazar's got a line, doesn't he, about how, you know, difficult it is to write introductions or how important they are. What's going on for me in the preface is simply I want to get the idea of the book title on the table. I'm not sure what people think of the book title. I'm not sure when I was creating it whether I thought that it worked or not, but it's what I went for. It's a little bit awkward to say. Literary theory is ... the essence of, sorry, rationality is ... the essence of literary theory. It's a bit awkward to say. And in the preface, I just wanted to introduce two different ways of reading that title. And I think those two different ways capture a kind of fundamental duality and ambivalence about the way that literary theory is approached. And so I wanted to get that on the table right from the outset. Turning to the introduction, there's I guess what I wanted to do there was, I mean, obviously in an introduction you want to kind of lay out the contents of the book as a whole. I felt obliged. I didn't do this immediately, but I felt obliged to take up the central issue for people who know theory, what they might be thinking, what they might be expecting when they come to a text like this is that, first of all, you're going to talk about this famous linguist who was writing in the early 1900s, and his name is Saussure, and in a lot of standard textbooks, you meet him really early, and you might get a little bit of a backdrop about what was going on in English studies, or the way English studies were approached before he had his big influence, and then you get his ideas, and his ideas have to do with language and linguistics, and they're quite technical. And I know for myself, in my own experience as a student, and in my experience trying to teach theory and then trying to help students understand, it sets the conversation off in a certain direction. It's very technical, very abstruse, and I thought, I don't want to do that, even though that's a really important part of the story. I'm gonna defer that, and so that's what I did, and I felt I needed to talk about that a little bit in the introduction. Another thing that's going on in the introduction for me is the way it ends, with a couple of quotations from Seamus Heaney and then from Gadamer, just quotations that are positive. Especially, I'm thinking of the one from Heaney in particular, positive about the role of truth in art, which you don't always get, or you might get an affirmation of truth in the sense of, you know, your truth or subjective truth. But I certainly read Heaney as saying something more bold than that, something more generalized and more affirming. And I wanted to say something like that at the outset, and I wanted to give the reader a sense of hope, and not simply of undercutting or undermining or reworking, important as those things are. I kind of stumbled into the idea of the Emperor's New Clothes. I know it's pretty shop worn or well known. I'll be interested to know if you guys, a few people think that it works. I do think that there's something like that going on. I do think that when people first come to theory, that the natural questions that they have about it, they feel sometimes they're just, well, surely there must be more to it than that, and that they're afraid to ask or state the obvious. And so I think sometimes we dance around some pretty basic questions that are, after all, part of the conversation. And I think that the illustration of the Emperor's New Clothes kind of fits that. So those were some of the things that I wanted to talk about straight away. A little bit of Canadiana right in the opening sentence, the reference to science and economics. But that's kind of what was going on for me as I was writing the introduction. For me, one of the most exciting parts of the book is finally getting to. I skipped chapter 1 for you. We can talk about what I skipped, but when you get to chapter 2 and I start talking about feminism, there I can finally really get into quoting Rivkin and Ryan. So Julie Rivkin and Michael Ryan are the editors of this 1,600-page anthology, now in its 3rd edition, which is obviously 3rd edition, very popular, very widely used. And what they do is they collect a whole bunch of primary source material, actual theorists who are writing the goods on these various approaches, and they themselves have introductions to the theories. And just their language, like they're the ones who say that, male reason and stuff like that. And I thought, as I'm writing the preface and intro, I'm thinking, does the reader even believe me? Do they even think that this could be a thing? Would people talk, rationality is male, rationality is white? Would anyone be so crass as to say that? And then when you read Rivkin and Ryan, you see the way they're throwing the terms around. I think it's quite vindicating. And really then I think that the reader can say, oh yeah, so this really is a thing, and what's going on with this? Whenever I read through the text, I get quite excited when I get to the opening pages of the feminism chapter and see how and see again just how it's being approached by a major textbook. I like the Irigere reading. I like the way I handle it. Teasing out some of the details of these various people is, it's taken me passage of time over the years, but I like the way that I read her and clarify her. I really like the Atwood reading. I really think that it works. I'm hoping that I can be in touch with Margaret Atwood. I'm not sure how you do that, but I'd like to show her my reading of Bluebeard's Egg. I think that she would like it. But at any rate, I have a lot of fun. I have a lot of fun teaching that short story. So those were the readings that I first gave to Father to share with the group, and then I added one right at the very end. I thought, well, why don't we do the conclusion as well? Because not only does it kind of recapitulate what has already been talked about in the introduction and then throughout the book, but it does add something a little bit new as well. I haven't been quite so pointed up to that point about language and what it means to just emphasize difference, what it means to sort of deny universals. And I use a passage from Terry Eagleton, whom I know we've talked about before, thanks to a presentation that Steve did. I find him incredibly funny. He's one of the earliest and one of the brightest people doing theory. He himself is a committed Marxist. And I think that the way that he weighs in on that topic is illuminating, helpful. I didn't give him the last word. I guess I came close to giving him the last word, but I think I pulled him into my conversation. I did have an exchange with him, and he wrote me back and was encouraging about my work. I then followed that up months and months later with an invitation to write an afterword to the book. But he's not on email, so I had to send a snail mail, and I sent the whole manuscript, and I never heard back from him. So I don't know if he got it or whatever. But anyway, that's kind of the long and the short of my introduction to these different readings. So I'll just throw it over to you, everyone, and whatever you want to talk about, I'm happy to chat.
Stephen.
Norm, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation now and for the excerpts you provided. I really enjoyed reading them. I've gone over them a couple of times, and I have my usual whack of questions, and I even had a handout for you, but it's unfortunate you're not here. The handout was only because you forced me to look on my shelves for another guy who wants to tackle rationality seriously. And I don't know if in your wide reading you've encountered Robert Nozick, but among the other things he wrote, besides his famous book, Anarchy, State and Utopia, was The Nature of Rationality. And I looked at his preface today just to see where he might align with you or not. And if you haven't encountered him before, he's a fellow traveler to a certain point. And I thought you might find that interesting. So at some point I will convey to you the 3-pager I've got from that book.
Because I don't know the name. No, I'm sure that would be a lot of fun.
He's passed on now. He died much too early, but he was a very important thinker, often put in the same sentence as John Rawls for a different tack on political thought. If I can just go on for a couple of minutes, Norm, is it fair to say that your book is both a critique and a defense of literary theory? Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's very fair.
Okay, well, I have a question that has 2 parts, and then I'll stop. What finally is your definition of rationality? I wonder if it's how it connects to other terms, sort of family-related terms like reason, reasonableness, perhaps even common sense, or more heavy-duty theological or philosophical conceptions of rationality. I'm wondering if you spell that out a little more than in the excerpts that we had, or whether you're hedging a bit on that and maybe seeing rationality as a stand-in for something bigger and different. So that's not a very clear question, but I'd be happy to hear what you might say.
I am hedging, and I think I hedged throughout the book. When I think of the word rationality and what does it connect with, so taking your suggestion, words like reason and reasonableness and common sense. For now, I decided to treat reason and rationality basically as synonyms.
Okay.
And there were times, like even when I was putting together the book proposal, where I misidentified the title of my own book because I kept interchanging the words reason and rationality. Yeah. And in the end, I thought that reason conjured too much the age of reason, France in the 17th century or something like that, Dame Reason. I thought, yeah, there's got to be something different between reason and rationality ultimately. But I think, no, for now, I'm just going to treat those two as synonymous, and I'm going to choose rationality just for, I guess, rationality to me, it can get kind of antiseptic, and this phrase discursivity or discursive reason or calculating reason that rationality seems to suggest. But I thought, no, I'll just use it, and it's still kind of a blanket term and fairly broad, and that'll do just fine. So what I connect it with is not the family of terms that you suggest, but I connect it with participation. I connect it with philosophical hermeneutics or radical hermeneutics. So I included the table of contents, but I didn't include a chapter from that section. So what I do is in the first, the first chapter is just to reassure ordinary readers of literature that, hey, a critique of reason or critique of rationality is something that literature does all the time. Don't be scared here. This is you can do this. But then in the chapters on feminism, critical race theory, and psychoanalysis, I think it's pretty devastating. And the attack on rationality is full-blooded. It's serious, and really undermines a person's confidence in what might be going on. And you know, depending on the mood I'm in, I could be quite negative about those opening chapters, quite aggressive in contradicting Rivkin and Ryan or calling them to task. But I do think that they're doing something important. And so kind of by the grace of God, I was able not to show my hand too much or not to be too strident in those opening chapters. But I did want to give an alternative view. And in the course of teaching, what I used to do was I would do that opening section, and then I would follow it through to Saussure and the linguistics, and then I would give an alternative towards the end of the term. But I thought, no, this is too long. This is too long of a deferral. And I have had students, like, you know, I'm sure you know this experience, right? Where someone is really connecting with your work or what you're saying or the text that you're reading, and they murmur in class, like they're just so taken by the possibilities. And I had a student do that with when we did a textual analysis of Rowan Williams' 5-minute YouTube video on the wedding of William and Kate, which is just a lovely little piece. And you know, it's a different kind of text, which is part of what literary theory is all about. Everything's a text. And it's an affirmation of personhood, of commitment, of sociality. And I felt really affirmed in that, in giving students an alternative sooner rather than later. So what I connect rationality to is that sort of climate, that sort of terrain, and I think maybe a single word that I'm after there, which I don't think I use in the text, is hospitality, or something hospitable, or an invitation into something.
Thank you. That's good.
I'd like to jump in if I may. Thanks, Norm, very much. And I think rationality was the right choice. In my humble opinion, as probably I kind of associate with the little boy in the analogy. I mean, I'm not a professional academic, and when I read that, I thought that was actually, I like that image very much. The little boy who saw the emperor has no clothes. And as someone who studied English literature years ago, who studied theory a long time ago, I definitely kept associating myself with the little boy as I read these chapters, and I look forward to reading the rest of the book when it comes out in the future. I mean, from my perspective, as a humble Thomist, I can put it that way, I agree that the emperor has clothes, but he might be only wearing underwear. So what I mean by that is I'm trying very, very hard to reconcile the terms of literary theory, the approaches, especially the ones I'm more familiar with, like deconstruction, with the wonderful quote you gave by Joseph Pieper. We talked about the abyss of light. As we know from the Silence of St. Thomas, Pieper is referring to the divine logos, which is, of course, a no-no for deconstructors. The divine logos, which is mirrored in creation. So creation has this infinite depth that we can't possibly totally comprehend. And it opens up into mystery. I just love that. And I thought that was perfect. At the same time, when I'm thinking about that, I'm thinking, well, doesn't Derrida, doesn't Roland Barthes, doesn't Paul de Man talk about the abyss of nothingness? How do, as the little boy who's gazing on this, how do I reconcile what seems, and because I didn't have access to your other chapters, and I think Eric was trying to help me out here as we were driving up on that.
Bring me into that.
So I'm trying to reconcile on the one hand, the abyss of nothingness, which rejects transcendental signifiers, which the divine logos would certainly be, and the Thomistic concept that depends on the divine logos for the first principles of the speculative intellect, for rationality. So you see where probably see where I'm getting at with this. I'm trying to comprehend maybe those concepts are incommensurable, which they seem to me as a simple Thomist. But maybe I don't know. I mean, similar to Steve, I kept thinking about Alistair McIntyre when I was reading his book, Justice, Which Rationality, in which he talks about the rationality of tradition. And there's so many traditions going on here. As you know, from feminism, which is dependent upon philosophical traditions of liberalism, Marxism, and post-structuralism. There's so many traditions intertwining. And McIntyre says you really need to have empathy in order to understand different traditions, even within your own tradition. So as a little boy Thomist, I'm trying to have empathy, and I'm wondering if you could help me out.
Well, I agree basically with what you're saying, and I am mindful throughout all of this of McIntyre is saying it's it's Aristotle or Nietzsche, and Nietzsche's certainly there in the book. I think Aristotle and Thomas, I bring in Thomas through the Peeper, is there, and I do think that incommensurability and the need to make a choice. I think that those themes are latent in the book. So I don't disagree with you. I hope that I'm not equivocating in the way that I've written the book. You might not be able to tell from the material that I've given, but the book is written for a wide general audience. Mm-hmm. I'm not appealing to a universal reason, as we can all agree on this and go so far together. That's not what I'm doing. But I am trying to present the material in such a way that I don't alienate a secular reader, an ordinary, everyday, run-of-the-mill undergraduate reader who is blindsided by this, whether they're secular or Christian. And I want to let them know that to the best of my ability, I understand the perspectives that are being proffered. Though I'm not a nihilist, I think that I'm under the skin of Nietzsche a little bit, and Foucault and Derrida. I think I get it. I think I'm empathetic to that perspective, and so I'd like to think that the undergraduate student is willing to trust me, and like they have to trust not only that I can empathize with that position, but with like what the hell is going on in these writers. Like they come to it not necessarily as I'm on this side. Most of them are just utterly confused. So you have the undergraduate who was who knew theory in the womb, and then you have the other 95% of the undergraduates who are just mystified, and not necessarily because they already know their metaphysical commitments, but they're just confused. So wanting to be able to talk with that audience, they could be 18, 19, they could be 30, they could be 50. It doesn't really matter. But I also wanted to be able to talk about the other side that doesn't it doesn't come in with a hammer blow. It doesn't close off the conversation. And I think the genius of Catholicism is that I think the Pieper quote really captures it. It's an abyss of light. The conversation is ongoing. There's always more that can be said. There's something to be gleaned from what people are saying. And I really wanted to avoid simply an either or kind of conversation. I didn't want to simply replicate culture wars or draw lines in the sand. I do think that you know, again, I do think that there are hard choices that have to be made. So I was saying in talking to Steve that, you know, radical hermeneutics is part of this in the middle section. Balthazar talks about middle terms, doesn't he? And you know, in the Rivkin and Ryan, there's nothing on Ricoeur or Gadamer or any of the heavy hitters when it comes to radical hermeneutics. It's a non-starter. It's a non-conversation. They encourage a kind of binary logic, and so simply by I'm trying not to use that section as the answer, but I am trying to use it as a, you know, folding in another way of talking about these things that actually is really relevant and can put students off on another path, or just get them thinking in additional ways to what they're encouraged to think.
Yeah, I like the idea of this kind of book, because you're right, it is really difficult to dive into literary theory, and I like the idea. Is this sneaky the right term of introducing people like that? I mean, the whole concept, you know, that it gets into your brain and sticks there, and might, because you do it at the beginning, so it's going to follow you throughout the book, I hope. You know, to that kind of concept that presents an alternative. Because I looked at, sorry, am I monopolizing? I just wanted one more comment. When I was reading this, I thought, okay, I look back at, we were talking about Terry Eagleton, and you mentioned Eagleton here. I took a look back at his early work, which is Introduction to Literary Theory. I know he's far more matured than that book, but some of the things he said, you talked about this sort of binary opposition. Like even Eagleton at that time was questioning whether literature even existed, and he would dismiss approaches like the new critics or phenomenological critics he didn't like as irrational. And I was surprised by that, because I don't remember that at all when I first read it as an undergraduate. So he was being very polemical. I know later on he sort of changed his view on literature doesn't exist, and that he's being too binary. But I think a lot of this discussion with literary theory, from my experience, my wife who taught English literature, that it is very polarizing.
Yeah.
And I greatly admire, you know, your attempt to get that polarizing environment out of there.
Well, it's just, it's crazy, because I think this is something that's reflects on university culture more widely, but you know, I just don't think that we can sustain the kind of readings that I used to have to do in my fourth year history seminar. I know that perhaps it's the institutions that I work in or the experience that I've had personally, but my sense is more broadly that students aren't pushed as hard, or don't have to work as hard. I hesitate to say that, because you know, I know that students who have gone on to other institutions and then are teaching perhaps as PhD students, they get thrown into an undergraduate class, and they're told that, you know, the average has to be much lower than mine own would be, so that maybe there's a rigor in those other institutions that has been softened in the institutions that I've been in. But my general sense is that it's you can't, the students are, I'm sure, capable, but they're not expected to be pushed as hard, and so you don't really know if you're just introducing the concepts, or if you can introduce the concepts and critique them and nuance the argument to the extent that you might want to. So I think that I've tried to do some of that in the book, and I think that it's the fruit of having done this for, you know, a very long time.
Can I ask a question in that vein? First of all, thank you, Norm, for the book. I wish I had it when I was doing my undergraduate English degree. I wanted to ask you a question about the practice of theory, because obviously theory and practice, they kind of go hand in hand. And it seems to me that from my experience, you can get talking about theory as an end in itself, whereas it's crying out for a text, basically. It seems like something's lacking if we're not applying the theory to a text. I use the word applying sort of reluctantly. I'm not sure if there's a better verb for it, but suffice it to say, we want to have practice going along with the theory. And your point about the way Rivkin and Ryan present the material, sort of reinforcing this individualist idea that we have this view from nowhere and we can kind of pick our favorite ism and apply it to the text, is well taken. I think that speaks to my experience, certainly. So could you share a little bit about your own approach to how you do the close readings that you have in the book, and how an interested reader that reads the book and then wants to go and learn more about theory and apply it to texts that they encounter in their lives, what kind of approach they should take?
I can try. I'm not sure I agree with you about the relationship between theory and practice, and simply for this reason, that I'm not sure that people who are in theory classes don't see themselves as philosophy majors or as theology wannabes, in which case I don't think that the text needs to be applied to a different kind of text. And in my experience, and now here, so there was a time back in the 90s where I got really interested in a guy named Simon Critchley, and I was working with some other people who were really, really keen thinkers, really, really sharp, and interested in philosophy and theology, and professionally trained in these disciplines. So I was, working with them, and I was, reading as I have a background I have an undergraduate degree in theology. I don't have a doctorate in philosophy, but I tried to work up my understanding of Critchley, and then I would bring this to bear in conferences. I just there wasn't a conversation to be had. Like, people, even young academics, or even just in a room full of professional academics talking about theoretical dimensions related to Chaucer or something like that. I decided they didn't really know their theory, or they didn't really know their philosophy. They had a certain take on things, but that it hadn't really been sustained. So I think there is room for doing theory in a way that is just utterly committed to doing philosophy well. And I think that a lot of people who do theory from an English point of view, they get on the theology and the philosophy train for a little while, and then they hop off. So that's kind of one aspect of my experience. On the other hand, I totally agree that no, damn it, I'm not a philosophy prof. I'm not a theology prof. I'm an English prof. And so let's apply this to the kinds of texts we're more accustomed to applying such things to. And I appreciate theory for broadening that. I appreciate theory for contributing to my ability to write about, The Simpsons or Breaking Bad if I want to. But yeah, at least in my own case, having been, and I'm going to go all the way back to the 60s. I'm going to go all the way back to being a kid in elementary school and being presented with a little bit of poetry and being asked to read this and finding it extremely difficult, but also that apparently I had some kind of an ability to do this, or at least that I was willing. I think it was more like I was actually willing to ask questions and expose myself in ways that maybe others weren't. I don't really think it was, so much insight as a kind of, I don't know, openness or offhandedness. But anyway, it bore fruit, and I've always been encouraged by the people whose opinions mean a lot to me, that, you know, I'm a decent close reader, and I like to come back to that. So I don't know how effectively I build a bridge between theory and practice in the way that you're outlining those terms. But I do try to do both, and to sort of, you know, put it out there and encourage the reader to do that too. I don't know if any of you will recall, but when this book was still sort of in germination phase, we were sitting at the Hooter one day and talking about this. And at that point, I had the idea of this text together with all the texts that you're supposed to read. And I had, so I was going to have those as an appendix, would have run to about 100,000 words. And, you know, obviously it would have been a much bigger book, not 1,600 pages like Rifkin and Ryan, but it would have been a bigger book. And then at the end of each section, I would have said, now go to the back and read the story, Bluebeard's Egg, and go and read the Irrigaray, and then come back and carry on. In the end, that was just, no one wanted it. It was impractical. And so what I did is I just extended the key quotations that I needed. But I really am hoping that people who really want to, who find, on a first read, who find this text useful, who find it helpful, who find it clarifying, that they're going to then go and say, okay, well, let's do this again. And this time I'm going to actually read the whole of the poem. Even that, one of the things, this book should have been out a year ago, but one of the things that held it up was getting permissions for poetry, which is extremely difficult to do. And to get permission to use a whole poem is well, I didn't even try. It just sounded like it was going to be impossible. So, but I'm hoping that people will, most of the stuff is online, and I'm hoping that they'll, you know, read the poems and then engage.
Norm, are you encouraging them to, like your students, to engage? Let's just take a poem, or even Margaret Atwood's story that you have there, from a particular perspective, theoretical perspective, or from any perspective. What I'm getting at is, what role do the older humanist critics have anymore in English studies? You know, and that struck me when I read, again, going back to Terry Eagleton, that I, you know, don't always agree with, but I love reading. He at one point said, well, who reads Northrop Frye anymore anyway? Well, I do, but again, I'm the little boy Thomas, so maybe that's why. But like, not just Frye, but even C.S. Lewis, Auerbach, you know, Abrams, all these people. What role do they have to play anymore?
Yes. The problem with the way that some theory courses is taught is the limitations of time.
Mm-hmm.
So, and again, one of the things that happens in most theory textbooks is they will start with a section on the way we used to read. And so they will have perhaps some of those names that you mentioned, and standard ways of reading. And then they'll introduce the options after Saussure starts getting taken seriously in the 50s and 60s. I didn't have the luxury of that. I didn't have the time for that. And I also think that there's a kind of a stalking horse kind of argument that's being used there. So what I do is I jump right in because I think that everybody now knows from their own experience. They know that feminism is a thing. They probably even know that feminisms is a thing. And then critical race theory, ditto. Freudian psychoanalysis, I think, is just in our culture. So what I do for students, and what I encourage readers to do at the end of that first section, is I just kind of hint at this. I didn't want to make it sound like a textbook, so I didn't overdo this. But what I'll do is in the classes, I'll say, okay, right, we've done 3 different literary works, and we've done 3 different theories. Now what I want you to do is I want you to apply one of the theories to one of the texts that we haven't already applied it to. So the student should be able to say, oh, right, so actually, I could do a feminist reading of, or no, I could do a psychoanalytic reading of Bluebeard's Egg. I don't just have to do a Irigaray reading of Bluebeard's Egg. So they get to mix it up that way, and hopefully that they can see their own ability to use creativity. And that's where, you get into choice there, and you get into this idea of kind of free willing, choose your own adventure type of thing, which I'm not trying to maximize that. I'm trying to restrain that, but I need to show that you can do that a little bit.
Thank you.
Norm, I heard McIntyre mentioned, and in looking at Eagleton and his title, titles can be a text too, right? So what is Eagleton saying with his title After Theory in light of McIntyre?
You know what? I have never had that thought. I have never connected those dots the way that you did there. The lights are going on for me right now. This is just, that's hilarious. And surely you must be right. Surely you must be right. The story that, and I can't remember if this story is told in the excerpts that I gave the group, but I had a colleague at the institution that I'm in now who used to teach literary theory, and a great reputation for his avant-garde postmodernism, is kind of, a talking point on campus. And I was chair, and I don't quite know how this happened, because you don't have to inspect everybody's syllabus, but I somehow got a look at his syllabus, and he had talked about it just in the opening blurb of his little syllabus, and he referred to it as against theory. I thought, okay, that's telling. I can't remember who it was that was saying, that Eagleton had a change of heart. Yeah, I think he did, but the title After Theory doesn't mean that he's entirely given up on his earlier positions, or that he's blown the whistle on the whole project, to use his phrasing. He uses the phrase after theory to talk about after theory has become assimilated, or now that we've gotten used to the idea of the necessity for this kind of thing. I do think there is a bit of an echo of something of a redress or taking back ground that he's given up. I do think that there is a bit of regret in that title. Now I got to go back and think about all the Aristotelian references in that book, and there are important ones. There's a chapter called Truth and Objectivity, from which I draw in one of the chapters, and where he talks about the relationship between facts and values, and where he talks about a relationship between love and reason, or love and rationality. I pair him with a mid-20th century philosopher called John McMurray, who wrote a book called Love and Reason. And so what Eagleton is doing there, he grounds, he names Aristotle explicitly, and Aristotle's idea of the political there. And so, I mean, as I say, you've just thrown the lights on for me. It's surely where after theory is becoming after virtue.
Okay, well, thank you. I have some other questions or comments, but maybe somebody else at the back, somebody online.
Sure, I'll step up a little closer. Thanks, Norm. I actually didn't get to the conclusion. I didn't look at the last thing that you sent out, but I enjoyed reading the stuff that's already shared. And I was interested in a couple of things. One is the term that Eric referred to as well, the view from nowhere. I've actually read The View from Nowhere, which is a book by Thomas Nagel. And I had this funny thing where I was a math student at Waterloo back in the 80s, and I decided to take, I don't know if you're referring to the same person or not, but it was a Stan Fogel's course on advanced literary criticism or something like that. And it wasn't a great course, but it was kind of fun. And I would suggest he portrayed himself, I guess, kind of a, you know, grandfather of Rifkin and Ryan, if you like, as the one calling out the emperor has no clothes. That's how he portrayed himself. In a way, I found that helpful because I was coming to the course as a kind of naive reader. I'll mention two authors in particular, people I love reading, Oscar Wilde and Hopkins. And just as a sort of high school, person taking English courses in high school, I always felt like we were being trained by the teachers I had trained to read poetry and plays and literature in a way that was an obstacle to my enjoyment of people like Hopkins and Oscar Wilde. So I actually found that I thought that the Fogel approach, which one of his texts was the Lyotard text, the postmodern condition, and basically I sort of summarized that very loosely as the end of all meta narratives as actually helpful. I didn't think it was profound, but it was for some reason or other found it as a helpful, a very simple move that allowed me to enjoy reading Oscar Wilde and Hopkins better than I could when I read them through the sort of high school, whatever, 1970s, early 80s kind of stuff that we were doing. So I appreciate your engagement with Rifkin and Ryan, because there is, I'm going back to the Youth from Nowhere, they would probably be very, very suspicious of the idea that there is some kind of view from nowhere by which we get what is objective. And I think that's where the contrasting abysses come into play, perhaps. But I think just suggesting that the abyss might be an abyss of light is a very, very crucial step. And I think that for me as a reader of the excerpts, a really important one, because if there's an abyss of light, then my reason is always finite and limited. But if it's participating in truth and beauty and goodness in a way that I will never comprehend, then I can really enjoy literature in a way that I couldn't if all I've got is failed attempts at rationality. I said a lot, but anyway, I really enjoyed your approach.
Thank you. Let me pick up on a couple things that I heard you saying. One is that, Stan is a very charismatic teacher. And one of the things that he does, and what theory teachers at their best do, is they invite a raucous kind of delight. And that's, that's such a wonderful thing. It's a breath of fresh air. It opens up the possibilities again. And it's one of the reasons, coming back to an earlier thing that we were talking about, why is there an equivocation? Are there, what do you mean by rationality, and which side are you on here? Like it's really difficult to want to close down the theory side, because there's so much there that is good, that is illuminating, and makes one confront the limitations of a certain conception of rationality that has become, I think, hidebound. Another thing that I heard you doing, Charles, is I thought that you were reapplying the image of the emperor with no clothes, that now the emperor with no clothes is the rationalism, or the scientific rationality, and that what theory does, that theory is the little boy that exposes that rationality as being an emperor with no clothes, which I think is brilliant, and again is not something that I was conscious of inviting when I wrote the introduction, but I hope that people do that as well. So there are. It's I appreciate you using the word participation again, because it's not as if there are two extremes and the truth is somewhere in between. I don't think that the doctrine of analogy and the idea of a participatory being allows us to do that, at least not in an overly simplistic way. I think that we have to throw ourselves into that abyss, and we need to, we need to we need to know that it's an abyss of light, and that there is hope.
Yeah, I know it's been said many times. I just want to thank you for that, because I think that's the key move in what you're proposing, which I find very hopeful is the right word, because when you point out with my old prof Fogel, hey, the emperor has no clothes, and we're just gonna laugh, it can be kind of a laugh of despair or nihilism, but only because there's other possibilities have not yet been explored or have been hidden back behind the Enlightenment rationality, which the Suzuki passage takes on quite well. And you just say, oh, well, there's another possibility. It reminds me of Walker Percy's novel Lancelot, which is Nietzschean, kind of a Nietzscheistic response to the moral corruption of the 20th century, until the very end, when the priest is the interlocutor of the protagonist, just says, well, there's another way of looking at all of this. I mean, the protagonist Lancelot has turned incredibly nihilistic in the face of the moral corruption of the 20th century, and the priest who's speaking with him while he's in prison, just at the end gestures to hope. Without the novel, it's not a novel about hope. It's a novel about the nihilism that the protagonist experiences. But I love this. I think the subtle gesture is really great.
One thing that I find interesting is in this conversation is how Aristotle keeps coming up. I mean,
Yeah.
in a sense that unless you don't want to be understood, and I know Foucault accused Derrida of the tyranny of obscurantism, because no matter what you say, you can say you misunderstand me. But Aristotle seems to be keeps coming up with these thinkers. We talked about Eagleton, we talked about McIntyre, and there's others. Now you have to ask, well, why is that? Because I think people want to be understood, and you can't be understood unless in some way you think in a certain propositional sense. Unless, I mean, you don't have to, argue in a propositional way, but you need to be understood in some way. And so, I mean, that's not the same thing as a view from nowhere or a meta perspective, but there's, and I'm just sort of thinking out loud here, but there is some kind of sense in which Aristotle was right, and we can't escape from that.
Or maybe for McIntyre, he's right in a way that he encourages one to follow him beyond himself.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's funny thing about McIntyre at the end of his book, Whose Justice, Which Rationality, something like that. He looks at the internal validity of the different traditions of rationality, and then he says, well, in the final page, well, I happen to think that the internal coherence of the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition is more coherent than the other traditions. You can't get away with having an opinion on what you think rationality is.
Yeah.
He does, at some point, McIntyre does say that he became Catholic because he decided that Thomas was a better Aristotelian than Aristotle.
That could be, yeah. The thing is about Aquinas that he absorbs not just Aristotle, but Augustine as well. And he talks about the Augustinian tradition. The important thing, and I think I learned this through Communio more than anything else, is the importance of Augustine for Aquinas. So we're not really giving an either or here. We're talking about how Aquinas absorbed and expanded upon, and that's Augustine, and that's what traditions do.
Just we're wandering a little far afield here, but it's such an interesting conversation. As part of that, I would encourage people to read the opening chapter of John Milbank's little book, The Suspended Middle. We haven't had much joy with Milbank in our group, but it's a chapter in which he's talking about the natural desire for God and supernatural finality, and he's clarifying a couple of points from de Lubac and Balthazar, and he talks about a confrontation with Aristotle and a need to push beyond Aristotle on one specific point. I don't want to get into the details, but it's not a long reading. The whole book is very thin, but the first 20 or 30 pages is of a very, not many words on a page, very small book, are germane to this conversation we're having right now.
Norm, I would take it that you're fairly comfortable with your notion of theory and the general notion of literary theory being at quite some remove from the understanding of theory in science. When I think of theory in science, I think of concepts like falsifiability, confirmation, predictability, repeatability of experiments, and so forth. Do any of your students have trouble with literary theory because it doesn't look like anything that they formerly encountered that was called theory if they've been in the sciences, let's say?
I do have students who come to theory classes, who come to lit classes from the sciences. They invariably bring a discipline and a rigor of thought that is just so refreshing and so helpful for the group as a whole. They're not afraid to ask the awkward question. I didn't have the pleasure of having Eric in my theory class, but Eric has a background in the sciences, and I've had him in other lit classes, and I've had other people come to English from physics and math, and they ask the hard questions, and that's good for everyone. I have occasionally had students who, well, more than occasionally, I've had students who are quite impatient with me and want a definition of rationality straight away, and I'm not going to give it to them, and they, what I feel is missing in that approach is a willingness to entertain a thought experiment in the way that someone else is inviting you to enter into the thought experiment. And I think that that's a really important skill for students, that they're willing to suspend disbelief and trust the readings that are on the syllabus, trust the way that a thing is laid out, and and dive into that. But I don't know that that's particularly a skill that people from specific disciplinary backgrounds lack or have. I've never really found that to be the case. I don't know. I find stimulating students coming from all over the map and thriving from a bunch of different perspectives.
I like that you used the word trust there, Norm. And if I might bring it back to something Deacon Charles was saying, it seems like this professor that he had that stood up in the face of all these theorists and sort of proclaimed that the emperor has no clothes. Maybe the word is liberation. It kind of liberated you from a certain commitment to a way of reading that allowed you to read the text again with enjoyment. And I've certainly seen a lot of classmates and experienced myself, but kind of you almost risk falling out of love with reading because theory becomes like a bludgeon or a scalpel that you use to go to town on this poor scared little text. But how can or how should theory enhance our enjoyment of reading? And that's kind of going back to the trust thing, that we're going into it hoping to get something out of it.
I think that again, this happens in the middle section when I'm doing radical hermeneutics, and I'm talking specifically about Ricoeur. Ricoeur has this lovely little reading. I only give the students 4 or 5 pages, but it's from a long essay on what's the essay called? Biblical Interpretation and Towards a Hermeneutic of the Idea of Revelation, something like that. So very, very long article. In the first half of it, he goes through all the different ways that revelation happens in the Old Testament. I don't ask the students to read that. Then he makes a little turn and he talks about the idea of how what's going on in biblical studies can perhaps be brought a little closer to what's going on in philosophy, and philosophy can perhaps be brought a little closer to what's going on in biblical studies. And in that context, he names Gadamer. And then he talks about how and he introduces the word poetic, and he means not just poetry, but something a little broader than that. And he says that the poetic obliterates, that's his word, obliterates discursive rationality, ordinary day-to-day reasoning, the kind of reasoning that's associated with science. And then he says, from here it might seem that our only option is to say that poetry celebrates itself. And this is where I find that a lot of students who aren't sure that there's any benefit to be had from theory think that they don't need theory because they know, quote unquote, that poetry celebrates itself, that it's subjective, that it's about getting in touch with your emotions, that it is just, inviting the imagination. And he says no, that there's what we're doing there is we're still saying that really what truth is some kind of adequation or verification or seeking of proofs. And he says, no, what the poetic does is it liberates a second order or a different order of technical word here, referentiality. In other words, that poetry actually does have something to say about the real world, but it's not done in the ways that we think it should be done by science. And so where I think that students of lit who, just would like it to stay in the 19th century. I mean, Hopkins is in the 19th century, but so is Matthew Arnold. And Matthew Arnold would have us just embrace culture with the capital C and embrace the best of what has been thought and expressed. And theory says that that's not going to do it. That's not going to be enough. We've become complacent here, and we're at ease with something that doesn't actually satisfy. So I think that theory is great for that, and necessary for English majors for that reason as well. I'm not sure, Eric, if I answered your question, but
I'm not sure if you answered it either, but I like what you said.
I'm just wondering, oh, sorry.
Oh, no, please.
Sorry, you talk, I've been talking to you.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you, Norm, for the book and the presentation. I have a small question. What do you think is the source for concept of identity besides the idea of social construction, that is the actual trend of ideas in feminists and other ideology we have in the present? What is the source, considering that after the crisis of metaphysics, Aquinas and Aristotle is not the source to comprehend identity of human beings?
Yes. Yeah, it's back in the day when theory was just getting going, or at least when I encountered it as a graduate student and then as a doctoral student, everyone was talking about the self, and such an important question and dimension. And so, for a while I would try to talk about the self in teaching undergraduates, but it's a question that requires so much context and getting the flavor of everything that's going on in theory as a whole. I think that is what everyone is still talking about, and they've turned it into identity politics. So it is feminism, it is critical race theory, which is another reason why those two chapters are presented very early. But I don't think that people realize that, in fact, identity is just a shell if you really follow this stuff through. If you really embrace constructivism and Nietzschean principles which are underlying it, being made by language, in the sense that most theorists mean when they use a phrase like that. I'm pointing. I say it in the preface. I use the word transcendent reality in the preface. It's what I mean when I talk about the abyss of light. I think that it draws in the question of identity as well. So I am just gently doing my bit to point people to transcendence, and then not just general transcendence, but to Christ, ultimately, to a Trinitarian understanding of what a person is and who a person is as part of the perfect society, which is the church. That's where I want people to be able to get to. They're not going to be able to get there through my book, but they might be nosed along in that direction, or at least might be willing to say, gee, actually, I guess there's a fair amount of theory going on in Aquinas or in church teaching, or in, yeah, why not? Why don't we just say it? Or in church teaching, right? Which is for so many people seems irrelevant, and yet I think is absolutely germane to the real questions that people are asking.
Do you think, Norm,
You go ahead, Victor, and then you.
okay, that the way theory is taught, the way the various forms of theory, feminism, critical race theory, stuff which I don't really know about, but it's only taught in certain ways. If you talk about feminism, of course, there's many different feminisms, but recently, you probably can't even teach this in a class. There's a lot of Catholic authors, female authors recently, that have written some really good stuff about feminism and the impact on that. I mean, my concern with the standard approaches to theory is that, to use their own language, kind of reifies an interpretation of a text. Well, has to be what it means because this is what Foucault says, or this is what Judith Butler says, right? Do you find that there's is that a temptation as opposed to reality? I don't know. I'm just wondering.
Yeah, absolutely. That's where I really do think I'm doing something different in this book. I really do think I'm making a contribution, and that I can, if this book, should happen to reach more readers than are present in this room and on this Zoom call, which is a very iffy proposition. But if it should happen to come to pass, that I really think that this is a strategy that can help with that, because I've just stripped it right down, and I think that what's latent in all of these things is a question of what do we mean by rationality, or are we sure we know what we're talking about? And then if you follow it through, the key terms that come up are difference. I mean, it's what Eagleton talks about in the closing chapter, but in the chapter on critical race theory, immediately following the one on feminism, the primary theorist that I use talks about hybridity, multiplicity, plurality, and you just read, you see how important these terms are, and these terms ultimately relate to historicism. And Pieper talks about this. He talks about the choice between, the temptations of Averroism, and he throws medieval Augustinianism under the bus as well. But Averroes as a kind of founder of history. George Grant talks about Rousseau and Rousseau's big move towards history as being pretty decisive. And to talk about history is to talk about incommensurable particularities, differences, and this is what. So this is where theory, I think, really does ultimately kind of funnel into, that you get a bunch of different forms of historicism and historical situatedness, and that's really where people, that's where a lot of the freedom comes from. You can be a feminist, you can be a critical race theorist, you can be a queer theorist, you can be a disability study theorist, you can be an environmentalist. You're going to talk about a specific place, you're going to talk about specific bodies, you're not going to generalize, and you're going to argue that, you know, this is what I'm talking about, and you discourage anyone from, you know, looking beyond that. You discourage anyone from asking the little boy's question. Because you're caught in the particularity, and you're supposed to stay there because it is a body, it is a sexual body, it is an earthly body. It is not nothing is being spiritualized here, nothing is being universalized. We are staying with the particular. God forbid that we should talk about the incarnation, but we can talk about particular bodies in particular places in particular political circumstances, and we can particularize, and that's all we need to do.
But it's interesting that, of course, Christianity or Catholicism is incarnational, right? And so, and that's where I think some of the new Catholic feminists are going, okay, well, let's take a look at what Christianity does or what Catholicism does. Let's take a look at the Genesis story, what's really happening. Just another alternative. I'm not sure that voice ever gets to be in the academy. You know, if I go to, I remember years ago going to accompanying my wife to some of these, you know, learned conferences and listening to papers. And, you know, if I stood up and identified myself as a Thomist, I'd be stoned. But so, you know, there's pluralism is accepted, but only a certain kind of pluralism.
Yeah. And I think it has a philosophical grounding.
True. I mean, there's a difference between pluralism and indeterminacy, right? Like you can accept pluralism, but, you know, question the sort of Derridian indeterminacy.
Norm, I haven't read Bluebeard's Egg, but as I first started reading your description of it, I thought it was comedy. And then you describe it as Greek tragedy. Can it be read as comedy?
Have you ever heard Margaret Atwood talk? She has the driest sense of humor, and it is so dour, and yet it is laced with this incredible wittiness. I don't remember saying that it was Greek tragedy. I guess, where did
Well,
I
on page 32, you just said Atwood is gifted at conveying the sense almost worthy of Greek tragedy, of the fear, sadness, and despair of Sally's life.
Yes.
Sally's life portends.
Yes.
The reason I ask, though, is that to me, mimicry sounds like comedy in the way that it exposes the underlying assumptions.
Yeah. Yeah, but okay, so yeah, I'm fine. I don't have a quarrel here at all. But of course, you can have your Horatian satire and your Juvenalian satire, right? Your Horatian satire can be ultimately uplifting and optimistic, glass half full. Your Juvenalian satire can be bitingly funny, but oriented towards, you know, scathing rebuke and oriented towards despair. So you can have your two kinds of comedy.
Okay.
And I wouldn't want to guess at the end of the day, really, which kind is Atwood's.
Fair enough. But I'm interested in raising the topic has more to do with incongruity and the place of incongruity. And how, I mean, it sounds like difference, but it's more than that, isn't it? Can you say something about incongruity in reading it like a text like Bluebeard's Egg? Like the way that it opens up something?
You ask all the hard questions, don't you? So,
You got
I mean,
me
when you ask,
thinking, you got me thinking.
when you ask that question, it makes me think good old-fashioned irony and good old-fashioned liberal humanism. And part of me wants to put Atwood exactly there in sort of the West End of Toronto, doing just fine, thank you, and you know, producing The Handmaid's Tale and you know, laughing out of the sides of her mouth and pretty self-assured, and I think that the incongruity that she spots, part of me thinks that she's got the limits of that all figured out and knows exactly what society needs to be. I think that's where I think a lot of theory doesn't necessarily follow its own convictions through to their own implications, and so her incongruity maybe does stop short of where difference ultimately takes you. And where difference ultimately takes you is what Eagleton identifies in the closing pages that I discuss in the book. But you know, the positive side of that is that incongruity is precisely the thing that opens us up to thinking, well, there must be more, and there's a kind of moreness that's implicit here, and we're back to the abyss of light, or the possibility of an abyss of light. So incongruity will be just fine. And, you know, maybe we'll find ourselves saying, you know, the cracks are where the light gets in. And I'm thinking of Leonard Cohen, and I'm thinking of Louise Penny, the mystery writer, quoting from Leonard Cohen.
Well, see, I mentioned this specifically, I mean, Stephen is next, but because I think there's something to the way that incongruity creates a perspective without being a view from nowhere. That the comparison of what is incongruous is revelatory in itself.
You know what? Can I get you guys to talk amongst yourselves for just a second? I've got to find a connection. I got to connect to the battery, so I'll be right back. I need about like 30 seconds. Okay.
Okay, 30 seconds.
So we're gonna talk about incongruity for 30 seconds?
No, forget about incongruity.
I'm just going to demonstrate it.
I did go back and read Bluebeard's Egg again. And I guess this is to answer Eric's question. I found Norm's comments made it even more enjoyable, although I can't remember exactly what I would have thought about it on my first reading, because that would have been when the book first came out. I'm a Margaret Atwood fan, and so it's been a long time since I had read it, but going back and reading it again was very enjoyable because of the comments that Norm made.
I'm wondering if Margaret Atwood, the literature transcends the kind of reading. I know he's using Gary to illuminate an aspect of that story, but certainly if she's a good writer, then she's going to transcend that kind of analysis, I would think. Because I'm tempted to, like, for example, with The Handmaid's Tale, which I read many years ago, looked at that as some kind of de Beauvoirian fantasy that breeding equals slavery, you know, that kind of thing. But I'm hoping that when literature has a certain depth to it, it can transcend that particular reading, which seems to be leaping out at us.
In that way, it's like the other arts.
I hope so. I mean, if it doesn't, then it fails as a novel, or you know, like Handmaid's Tale. In my personal opinion, for what it's worth, I think it fails as a novel, but that's another question.
Yeah, but Victor, on that, like, just, you know, implicit there is the idea that Irigaray narrows, but Irigaray herself, what if Irigaray herself is an artist? We're calling it theory, and it's a different kind of text, but what if it's equally opening up as Margaret Atwood, the short story writer?
But what if it closes instead of opens? Like, who makes that
Not
distinction,
necessarily, right? like, I think, you know, ultimately, yeah, ultimately, you're going to have to query the metaphysical the metaphysical presuppositions that are informing the thing. But in
Right.
that regard, I wouldn't say that Atwood is necessarily any further ahead than someone who chooses to write the kinds of things that Irigaray writes.
Well, but my point is this, sorry, Norm, is that with Atwood, because we were talking about, I'm not talking about Blueberries, if you talk about The Handmaid's Tale, would Atwood have written that novel if she was pro-life? Of course she wouldn't have. I mean, there's an ideology, like a lot of the theory says, we want to expose the ideological assumptions that are typically there. But to me, that's very ideologically driven, and her statements have only confirmed that over the years, and subsequent statements by her have. And I want, to me, that lessens the impact of the book as literature.
Stephen,
Anyway, that's just.
Norm, I highlighted a number of your excellent sentences, nice juicy sentences in all these pages. And one that stood out for me was at the end, and you've already, I think, covered this pretty well. One can either join in unmasking rationality and explicitly seeking to undermine it, or one can seek a renewed understanding of what rationality itself might be. I'm wondering if that is your call to arms, your recruitment drive there. If a person takes the second option that you offer, is that what you would like to see happen? And if so, does it have any implications for society or more specifically for politics?
Yeah, I think it is. I'm going to resist the phrase call to arms, though, because I think as soon as I say that, maybe I don't do that in that context, but I'm certainly thinking it, and I know I come back to it as I say, look, the first one can't be abandoned. So the chastening or the invitation to rethink assumptions that you get with the pretty strident descriptions of rationality is male, et cetera, I think they remain relevant. But yes, I ultimately want to not go down that rabbit hole. I want to be chastened. I want the reader to be chastened and to be reinvigorated to think, well, just what is rationality then, and what can it be? And I think we need it. I think we need it especially now. And I allowed myself one paragraph about how, you know, if a person isn't writing for their own time, then what's the point of what they're writing? And I showed that paragraph to Eric, and he said this is exactly the kind of thing that needs to be in this book, and I do think that ultimately that's a political thing, right? That means, look, particularly in the States, but maybe in Western cultures more generally, we seem to be at a bit of an impasse. Technology isn't helping. And we need encouragement to keep thinking, what is it that we think we're doing when we're being rational?
And I'm going to conclude my offhand remarks, Norm, with a terrible pun, but I'm going to conclude that Norm Clausen's theory of theory is indeed normative.
You like that one. Yeah, you know, the norm, it has more than one meaning, right? I was just thinking about from a couple of years ago, the reaction against Margaret Atwood from people in the kind of gender fluid world. And I think what's interesting to me as a Catholic is that kind of conversation, which I think is in your reading of how Irigaray has been reread, allows actually room for different conversations than were previously possible. And if I may come back to mention Hopkins and Wilde in particular, to think of them as, you know, Victorian or whatever Wilde is, but sort of Victorian or late Victorian voices who also are theorizing about rationality. And I'm a little confused, but I don't think, we watched The Importance of Being Earnest just a couple weeks ago at Shaw. It's been years since I read it. And I found myself taking the play not as a comedy, although it was a lot of fun, I laughed long, but also as a critique of rationality. I mean, the Lady Bracknell character, a certain kind of economic rationality. And actually what counterposes to it, because I've been reading about the Oxford movement, is just because I've been reading a lot of Oxford movement related stuff recently, is the significance of the character who comes in at the end, Canon Chasuble, and the high church ritualism, which is very close to Catholicism, becomes a kind of very strange question of whether these two protagonists will be christened again. And I reading about Wilde, he actually was christened a second time by his mother in the Catholic Church, he and his brother, when they were about 5. And to consider that we had a room full of people, of whom I was probably one of the younger. There were younger people there than me, but for sure, but mostly people older than me, laughing along with Wilde, laughing at late Victorian rationality, and in a way taking the question of christening very seriously, which has to do with all kinds of questions about baptismal regeneration and so forth, and the reality of the sacraments, was very interesting as an exercise in theory. Like that play has a lot of really heavy theory, I think, embedded in it. And I think we're actually at a time when Margaret Atwood is the old guard, and kind of blocking the way of the next step in deconstructing everything, and Irigaray is the old guard, as you're pointing out, then we have, I think, interesting opportunities to look at the question of whether the abyss is an abyss of light that we didn't have a while ago, which I think your book inserts itself into that place, which I love about it.
Thank you.
Norm, I want to just mention at the end, something that I found very striking on page 147 was that yet whenever we encounter reality, hope is renewed. I thought that was really important.
Yes, I think that's, that's sacramentalism, isn't it? That's my sacramentalism. That's certainly, writing this book, thinking about this stuff over the years, has certainly contributed to my being drawn into the Catholic Church. I just think that sacramental thinking, proper, thorough, consistent sacramental thinking, is ultimately necessary for coming through contemporary theory and contemporary, philosophical commitments going back to existentialism and the other movements of the 20th century. I think that a proper sacramentalism is the answer to that. And I suppose that a statement like that is kind of reflective of my journey.
I think it also gives me a sense of having courage to seek the reality, even if at first it may seem uncomfortable, but knowing time and time again that yes, when you do encounter reality, it leads to hope. Like even if you're wanting to deny it at first, being and renewed, hope renewed. Yeah, I really like that. Thank you for that. I have one last thing.
Sorry,
Okay, you go last.
Just one last question, that's a irreverent question, but when the book comes out as communal members, is there a discount available?
No.
The book is out. The book was officially published on the 27th. I don't know if it's up on Amazon yet. I'm still trying to, I've got 30 days to get a hefty author's discount if I order 100 books or more. I'm not sure if I'm going to do that because we're going to the UK. So I've asked questions, I'm trying to negotiate that. One of the things that I remember reading in the author material in the publishing process was that I can put a discount code. I don't know if I could just give it to people, but I can put a discount code on a YouTube channel. And Eric and May have been helping me to do that, to put up a YouTube channel. And May and I had a couple of great conversations, and they're up there. And as soon as I can figure it out, we'll do that. We'll put a discount code up there. And can I do something different or more for friends and family? I hope so, and I'll try to do that.
I
But
mean, I
it's
was
me.
just kind of joking about that. I didn't know that such a thing existed. I mean, a friend of mine who taught philosophy at Western, he had published a book recently on quietism, and when it was Springer publication, so it cost like $125. And I said, oh my gosh, it's $125. Well, he had an extra copy that he gave to me. But so I have no idea about discounts.
This is $22 US.
Oh, that's it?
I think it's $9.99 US on Kindle.
Wow,
I think there's a hardback version for $35 US.
right?
I can help you out at that price.
So, well, that's good, because it's more of a general audience.
Yeah, that's a good price.
Yeah. The
Nice.
difficulty is that, I mean, Cascade Press is the premier imprint of Whitman-Stock, but it is still really, I think it's a theological press. I'm not going to call it a hole in the wall, but I need to do work to get the word out. And any help that people can give me, I'm going to be trying to be in touch with people who teach theory courses. That's always an awkward thing, because it's a big deal to change the text that you rely on for teaching your own material. So, but that's the hope, is that it will just attract a groundswell, and that of course takes time. But then you need to kind of strike early too, because in a couple of years there's another text out there, there's something else. So you sort of you kind of have to be doing the business, and so.
Thank you.
Speaking of the book and the book cover and of norms, did you choose the image on the cover?
I did, and I paid $1,500 US for the rights to use that image, and I paid another $250 US for a high definition version of that image, which someone else held the rights to. Luckily, I got this all paid for through a little internal grant at St. Jerome's, but no, I love the image. The image goes with my discussion of Freudian psychoanalysis, and with a story called The Use of Force by William Carlos Williams, which will take you all of 15 minutes to read. It's very, very fun.
Oh, good to know. Okay. Thank you, Norm. Well, unfortunately, our time's up. So thank you for allowing Communio to facilitate your launch, and congratulations.
Thank you.